Hi guys, tonight we're quietly stepping into a side of World War II that rarely appears in history books. The part where everyday people live for weeks without soap, clean water, or even a place to wash their hands. In the next moments, we'll gently explore how ordinary families learn to survive in a world where hygiene became a distant luxury. This won't be dramatic or intense, just a calm walk through the quiet reality most civilians had to face. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. Life without soap during the war began not with a sudden shortage, but with a slow fading of supplies that people at first barely noticed. A store that once sold familiar bars in neat stacks would gradually run out of one brand, then another, until the shelves looked emptier each week. People didn't panic right away. They simply assumed new shipments were delayed. But as months passed and transportation routes broke down, it became clear that hygiene was quietly slipping out of reach. Many families started rationing what they had, cutting their remaining bars of soap into thin slices to make them last longer. Some kept the smallest leftover pieces in jars filled with water, shaking them now and then to create a thin, cloudy liquid they called soap water. It wasn't much, but it helped wash hands when nothing else could. Water itself became part of the struggle. In many towns, the pumps were damaged, or the pipes went dry, leaving people to walk long distances with buckets in search of wells that still worked. Sometimes the water tasted metallic from old pipes, or carried a faint smell of soil, but no one complained. Clean water wasn't expected anymore, just water that didn't make you sick. Bathing turned into a rare event, something families planned for as carefully as a holiday meal. People heated small pots of water over a stove, mixed them with cold water in a basin, and washed with slow, deliberate movements. There was no rushing. Every drop mattered. Children were washed first, the elderly next, and adults last, using whatever remained. Towels couldn't be washed often, so they hung for days in the same place, drying in the breeze and carrying the soft, dusty scent of the home. Clothes were worn again and again before washing. Instead of soap, people beat the garments with wooden paddles in river water, hoping movement and time would lift some of the dirt. They used ash from the fireplace as a natural scrub, rubbing it gently into fabrics before rinsing them in cold streams. The clothes didn't come out bright or fresh, but they felt lighter, cleaner, and that was enough. Even simple things like brushing teeth became complicated. Toothpaste was almost impossible to find. So many people used baking soda, crushed charcoal, or just water. The feeling wasn't pleasant, but it gave a small sense of normal life, a reminder that even without proper hygiene products, people still tried to care for themselves. What made this period so unique wasn't the hardship itself, but how calmly people adapted to it. There was no choice but to shift into a slower, quieter rhythm where comfort faded but routines persisted. The world was changing around them, but inside their homes, families continued the small acts that made life feel human: washing, rinsing, wiping, and hoping for better days. This is where our journey begins, with the gentle, everyday adjustments civilians made when the world lost its familiar tools of cleanliness. And in the next part, we'll step deeper into how people kept their homes livable when soap, water, and time were never guaranteed. In many households during the war, the absence of regular hygiene didn't just change routines, it reshaped the atmosphere of daily life. People woke up knowing that simple tasks like washing their face or cleaning their hands would require planning, patience, and often creativity. Water, when available, was stored in jars, pots, and metal buckets, each carefully covered with cloth to keep out dust. Families learned to reuse small portions again and again, first for washing, later for cleaning floors, and finally for watering small vegetable patches. Every drop carried value, and no one wasted anything. The mornings were quiet. Instead of the familiar sound of running water, homes filled with gentle splashes from basins as people washed slowly, using cloths instead of soap to remove the night's dust. Parents taught children to wipe behind their ears, around their neck, and between their fingers, using nothing more than warm water and careful movements. It wasn't perfect, but it was clean enough to begin the day. Hair care became another challenge. Without shampoo, people relied on combs, warm water, and sometimes a pinch of baking soda if they were lucky enough to have some left. Women brushed their hair with long, steady strokes, believing that natural oils would keep it healthy. Men shaved less often, not because they wanted to, but because razors dulled quickly, and shaving without proper soap made the skin burn. Some households collected rainwater whenever the sky allowed it. Buckets were placed under gutters, pots were left in courtyards, and when the rain finally arrived, it was treated almost like a gift. Families washed more thoroughly on those days, enjoying the freshness that came from rainwater's softness compared to the heavy mineral taste of well water. Inside homes, cleanliness became a gentle battle against dust and soot. Fires, candles, and kerosene lamps left thin layers of grime on shelves and window frames, so people wiped surfaces with damp cloths soaked in leftover water. Without disinfectants, they relied on airflow. Windows open whenever possible, even in cold months, letting the breeze carry away the stale heaviness that accumulated overnight. Many civilians created new habits to maintain a sense of comfort. They aired blankets daily, shaking them outside regardless of weather. They folded clothes neatly, even when those clothes hadn't been washed in weeks. Order replaced cleanliness, giving homes a feeling of calm that soap once provided. People found small ways to feel refreshed. A simple splash of cool water on the wrists, a damp cloth pressed to the forehead, or the scent of dried herbs kept inside drawers, lavender, mint, chamomile, brought lightness to rooms where hygiene tools were missing. These tiny rituals offered a quiet sense of control in a world that constantly shifted. And through all this, civilians carried an unspoken understanding. They weren't striving for perfection. They were simply doing what they could to stay healthy, comfortable and human in a time when the most ordinary comforts had slipped away. In the next part, we'll move closer to the kitchens and see how people kept their food, preparation areas clean without soap, disinfectants, or reliable water. In wartime kitchens, cleanliness without soap became a slow, thoughtful ritual that civilians approached with the same patience they used for cooking. Every surface, tool, and container had to be managed with limited water and almost no proper cleaning supplies. Families learned to keep their kitchens orderly not because things were spotless, but because order itself reduced the need for washing. Cutting boards, usually made of wood, were scraped with knives to remove crumbs and residue, then wiped with cloths dipped in warm water, mixed with a pinch of salt or ash. The ash, surprisingly effective, absorbed oils and softened dried bits of food. Pots were cleaned with sand when soap was unavailable. The rough grains rubbed across the metal until it looked dull but serviceable. People didn't aim for shining surfaces, they aimed for safety. Sponges were rare, so civilians used old pieces of fabric and rinsed them between tasks, hanging them near the stove where heat could kill at least some of the bacteria. Plates were washed immediately after meals, not because it was convenient, but because dried food was nearly impossible to remove without soap. Many homes used 2 bowls, one for washing, the other for rinsing. The water in the washing bowl grew cloudy quickly, but families stretched it through the entire meal's dishes before pouring it outside or saving it for mopping floors. Kitchens carried a mix of scents: smoke from firewood, earthy water from wells, the faint sourness of cloths used too many days in a row. Still, people adapted by keeping windows open or simmering herbs in small pots to freshen the air. Mint and bay leaves were especially common, both adding aroma and giving a comforting sense of warmth. Food storage brought its own challenges. Without the ability to thoroughly disinfect containers, civilians relied on cool cellars, cloth covers, and constant vigilance. Jars were rinsed with boiling water, though not always enough to remove lingering odours. Bread boxes were brushed daily, and any sign of mould was taken seriously. People cut away large sections of affected food rather than risk eating something unsafe. Utensils made of metal were boiled when possible, although fuel shortages often made this rare. Boiling water became a luxury reserved for the most essential items. like baby bottles or small knives used for vegetables. Kitchens stayed organised because disorder meant danger. Insects, contamination, spoiled food. So everything had its place. Pots stacked by size, knives wrapped in cloth, dried herbs hanging from hooks, and buckets of water standing in corners, ready for the next task. Despite the shortages, mealtime was a moment of calm. Families gathered around small tables, knowing the effort it took to prepare even the simplest dish under such limited conditions. And when the meal was done, the quiet rhythm of cleaning began again. Slow movements, careful wiping, and the soft sound of water being poured from one bowl to another. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians cared for their bodies when baths were rare and privacy even rarer, creating small moments of comfort in a world that offered so few. For civilians during the war, caring for their own bodies without soap, warm water, or privacy became an exercise not just in patience, but in quiet resilience. Bathing was no longer something done casually. It became a planned moment, arranged around the availability of water, the weather, and the small stretches of time when a home felt safe enough to relax. Most people washed using a simple metal basin placed near a stove, where water could be heated in small pots. They began with the face, dipping a cloth into the warm water and pressing it gently over the eyes and cheeks, before wiping in slow, deliberate circles. Even without soap, this ritual offered a refreshing sense of renewal. Necks, armpits, and hands were cleaned next, followed by arms and legs, each part washed with the same cloth, rinsed and wrung out again and again. The water grew cloudy quickly, but families had learned to work with whatever they had. Men often used the basin last, after children and older relatives had bathed, using the remaining water with quiet acceptance. Women, especially, found ways to feel clean without the comforts they once knew. They brushed their hair daily, sometimes multiple times a day, believing that careful grooming helped replace what they lacked in soap. A well-kept brush became as valuable as any tool. It removed dust, distributed natural oils, and offered a soothing, grounding rhythm across long, uncertain days. When water was scarce, civilians turned to alternative methods, wiping the body with slightly damp cloths, washing feet in small bowls, or using herbal infusions made from mint, chamomile, or thyme to freshen skin and calm irritation. The scent of these herbs lingered softly on the body, giving people a brief feeling of comfort and dignity. Clothing, worn many days in a row, absorbed sweat and dust, so undergarments were rinsed in basins whenever possible. Even a quick rinse made them feel lighter. Socks were prioritized. Keeping feet dry was essential, especially in regions where cold weather made conditions harsher. People dried clothes near fires or on ropes stretched across kitchens, the air warm with steam on washing days. In more crowded homes, privacy nearly disappeared. Families shared rooms, basins, and routines, turning away politely or stepping outside when someone washed. These gestures of respect became a silent language, a way of maintaining personal dignity in a world that offered very little space for it. Body odour became normal, something families no longer commented on. Instead, they focused on small habits, airing blankets each morning, sweeping floors to reduce dust, and opening windows to let in fresh air even on cold days. These acts created a feeling of cleanliness that went beyond the body itself. Illness was a constant concern. Without proper hygiene, infections spread easily, so civilians learned to clean wounds with boiled water and strips of cloth, changing bandages as often as supplies allowed. They relied on home remedies, soothing skin with simple mixtures of oil or melted animal fat when dryness or irritation grew painful. Despite the challenges, what stood out most was the calmness with which people adapted. They accepted that hygiene would no longer look the way it once did. Instead, it became quieter, slower, and more intentional. And within these small rituals, they found a way to hold on to their humanity. In the next part, we'll look at how families managed laundry, when soap was nearly impossible to find, and water was a resource that had to be earned, carried, and protected. Laundry during the war became one of the most physically demanding and time-consuming tasks civilians faced, especially without soap or steady access to clean water. Clothes could no longer be tossed into a wash tub with rich lather and left to soak until fresh. Instead, each garment required effort, patience, and often long walks to rivers or communal wells where washing was even possible. Most homes owned only a few sets of clothing, so families stretched each item as long as they could before washing it. Undergarments and children's clothing were washed first, since these absorbed the most dirt and sweat. Larger items like trousers, skirts, and sweaters waited until enough water could be collected to justify the work. Wooden basins, often worn and cracked from years of use, were filled with water heated on stoves. Without soap, people relied on ash from burned firewood. A handful of ash mixed into warm water created a soft, cloudy solution that acted as a gentle cleanser. Though it lacked fragrance and bubbles, it helped loosen dirt from cotton and linen fabrics. Women rubbed the fabric between their knuckles, creating rhythmic, steady sounds that filled small kitchens with a calm, familiar pattern. When fuel was too scarce to heat water, civilians walked to rivers. Even in cold weather, they stood on muddy banks or icy stones, beating clothes against flat rocks to force out dirt. Some carried wooden paddles to hammer garments repeatedly, a technique passed down through generations long before soap became common. Their hands grew numb from the cold, but the movement warmed their arms and helped them continue. Rinsing the clothes was often the hardest part, since clear water was limited. Families reused rinse water repeatedly, beginning with the cleanest items and ending with the dirtiest. As the water darkened, it became less useful, but waste was unthinkable. People poured the final grey water onto gardens, believing even this small contribution helped nourish plants. After rinsing, clothes were wrung tightly and hung on ropes stretched across courtyards, balconies, and kitchen ceilings. In winter, garments stiffened with frost before thawing slowly indoors. A line of drying clothes became a common sight in nearly every home, not because it was convenient, but because it was a sign that life was continuing. The scent of clean laundry changed during the war. Instead of soap or detergent, fabrics carried the smell of river water, smoke, or the faint mineral scent of well water. Yet these smells became comforting, reminders of hard work and perseverance rather than hardship. Stains were accepted as part of life. Without soap, bleach, or scrubbing brushes, civilians learned to live with marks on collars, sleeves, and hems. No one judged. Everyone understood. What mattered was that the clothes were as clean as circumstances allowed. When someone had a baby in the house, laundry doubled. Families boiled cloth diapers when they could, but this required precious fuel. On most days, diapers were rinsed, hung to dry, and reused quickly. Caring for infants demanded creativity and endurance, and mothers often spoke of laundry as one of the quiet but exhausting battles of their daily routine. Through all of this, laundry remained more than a chore. It was a way to bring order into a chaotic world, a means of caring for loved ones when comfort was scarce. Each washed garment represented effort, hope, and a determination to maintain dignity. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians kept their homes clean when tools, water, and basic products were disappearing one by one. Keeping a home clean during the war, with almost no soap, limited water, and constant dust drifting in from damaged streets, became a slow and thoughtful process that civilians treated with quiet determination. Cleanliness stopped being a pursuit of perfection, and instead became a daily effort to maintain a sense of calm in surroundings that often felt unsettled. Most floors were swept multiple times a day because dust settled quickly from bombed roads, cracked walls, and coal-burning stoves. Without proper brooms, people tied bundles of twigs together or used old fabric wrapped around wooden handles. The sweeping wasn't loud or hurried. It was gentle, almost meditative, producing small clouds of dust that drifted toward open windows. Water for mopping was precious, so floors were washed only when absolutely necessary. Families reused the same small bucket of water throughout the house, beginning with the cleanest room and ending with the kitchen. Ash or small amounts of vinegar were sometimes mixed into the water to cut through grease or lingering soot. Though the floors never looked spotless, they felt cared for, and that mattered more than appearance. Windows were another challenge. Smoke from nearby fires, cooking stoves, and kerosene lamps left thick layers of soot on the glass. Without soap, people wiped the windows with cloths dipped in water, mixed with a pinch of charcoal or crushed chalk. This created streaks but removed the heaviest grime, allowing a bit more daylight to enter rooms that often felt dim. Furniture was cleaned with dry cloths. Polishing, once a weekly ritual in many households, disappeared entirely because oils and waxes became luxuries no one could find. Still, people dusted shelves and tables by hand, lifting objects carefully and returning them with intention. These small acts created an atmosphere of order that helped families feel grounded. The battle against insects was constant. Without chemical sprays, civilians relied on simple methods, placing dried herbs near windows to discourage flies, burning small amounts of lavender or mint, or using homemade traps made from jars filled with sweetened water. In rural areas, ants and beetles wandered freely through cracked walls, so people hung food from rafters or stored it in crates lined with cloth. Kitchens were tidied multiple times a day, not out of preference but necessity. Any crumbs left overnight invited pests, and water shortages meant dishes couldn't pile up. Families wiped tables with damp cloths, rinsed knives immediately after use, and kept pots turned upside down to protect them from dust. Beds required careful attention too. Without frequent washing, blankets and sheets were hung by windows each morning to air out. Sunlight, even on cold days, acted as a natural cleanser, and people believed it helped reduce odours and refresh the fabric. Pillows were beaten gently outside to remove dust, sending soft bursts of feathers or fibres into the wind. Walls and ceilings collected soot from stoves, and though cleaning them thoroughly was impossible, families wiped around lamps, door frames and corners with damp cloths whenever water allowed. These small patches of clean space offered a sense of brightness and comfort. What civilians understood deeply was that a home didn't need to be perfectly clean to feel safe. It only needed to feel tended to, shaped by hands that cared, even when supplies were low. People created routines not to chase cleanliness, but to preserve a sense of normalcy, warmth, and dignity. In the next part, we'll explore how children adapted to the world of limited hygiene, learning new habits, sharing responsibilities, and finding small moments of joy despite the shortages surrounding them. For children living through the war, adapting to a world with almost no soap and limited hygiene didn't feel unusual at first. Many were too young to remember life before shortages began, so the routines adults considered burdensome became the natural rhythm of their days. Still, even in the quiet acceptance of wartime childhood, there were moments when the lack of cleanliness shaped their lives in ways both subtle and profound. Mornings began with a simple ritual. A small cloth dipped in a basin of cool water, gently wiped across faces and hands. Parents taught children to clean behind their ears, between their fingers, and along their necks, emphasizing these steps with the same seriousness once reserved for schoolwork. Without soap, this daily wiping became the primary form of personal care, and children learned to do it patiently, knowing water could not be wasted. Their clothing, often handed down from older siblings or neighbours, carried signs of constant wear. Patches covered knees and elbows, and colours faded into soft, muted shades. Children rarely complained. The clothes were warm, familiar, and part of the environment they had always known. Washing these garments required planning. On laundry days, children helped their parents beat the clothes against rocks near rivers, watching droplets scatter in the cold air. Their laughter often mingled with the sound of rushing water, turning a difficult chore into a moment of shared resilience. Hair care became another careful task. Without shampoo, parents brushed their children's hair daily, removing knots with slow, steady movements. Some used warm water with a pinch of baking soda to clean scalps, while others relied on the natural oils that built up over time. Boys kept shorter hair to make washing easier, while girls often wore braids to reduce tangles and keep dust at bay. School, when it continued, came with its own hygiene challenges. Classrooms were crowded, and children sat close together, sharing limited space and often limited air. Teachers opened windows whenever possible, even in winter, allowing crisp breezes to sweep through the room and carry away the stale scent of bodies that had not been fully washed in days. Playtime remained one of the happiest parts of a child's life, even during the war. But without proper hygiene, scrapes and cuts became worrisome. Parents cleaned wounds with boiled water and strips of cloth, praying infections would not follow. Children learned to protect their hands during games, to avoid sharp debris and bomb-damaged streets, and to return home immediately if they were injured. Despite the limited conditions, children still found ways to feel refreshed. They splashed in puddles after rainstorms, rinsed their feet in shallow creeks, or cooled their faces with handfuls of water drawn from wells. These small moments of relief brought a sense of freedom and innocence to days often overshadowed by uncertainty. What stood out most was how quickly children adapted to new norms. They accepted that soap was rare, that warm baths were special occasions, and that cleanliness meant something different now. Their resilience wasn't heroic or dramatic. It was gentle, steady, and woven into the fabric of their everyday routines. And in this quiet adaptability, they carried a kind of hope that adults sometimes struggle to find. In the next part, we'll explore how communities work together to maintain hygiene, sharing tools, water, and knowledge when individual households could no longer manage alone. Communities during the war often became the backbone of survival, especially when it came to hygiene. Individual households struggled with shortages, but when neighbours pooled their limited resources, they created small pockets of comfort and safety that none of them could have achieved alone. These networks of quiet cooperation helped families endure a world where soap had vanished, water was rationed, and cleanliness became a shared responsibility rather than a personal routine. In many towns, communal wells turned into gathering places. People lined up early in the morning with buckets, pots and jars, knowing the water level dropped quickly. Conversations remained soft, respectful, and practical. Neighbours exchanged advice about cleaning clothes with ash, boiling water for infant care, or finding herbs that helped soothe irritated skin. Every shared tip was a small gift, passed along with hope that it might make someone else's day a little easier. Some communities established informal washing areas near rivers, places where families could rinse clothes or clean pots when their own homes lacked water. These spots were never elegant, muddy banks, rough stones, and the occasional makeshift wooden bench, but they became important social spaces. People worked side by side, beating garments against rocks, discussing news, quietly encouraging one another. Children played nearby, chasing each other while their parents scrubbed fabric with patient movements. When fuel shortages grew severe, entire streets coordinated cooking and cleaning around shared stoves or fire pits. One family might heat water for several households, allowing everyone to take turns using the warmth while conserving precious wood or coal. The steam rising from shared basins created a sense of unity, a reminder that even simple warmth was easier to manage together. Women's groups formed naturally from necessity. They met to sew patches onto clothing, repair blankets, and create simple, reusable cloths for washing and cleaning. Without access to new textiles, these gatherings became essential. People exchanged scraps of fabric, traded needles, and helped one another maintain the few belongings they still had. These moments often carried more emotion than words could express. Gratitude, relief, and the quiet strength that comes from not facing hardship alone. In rural areas, communities relied on traditional remedies and passed them between households. Dried herbs, homemade salves, and simple cleaning techniques travelled from neighbour to neighbour. Sometimes a family would share a small bit of vinegar or baking soda with another, knowing they might never get more but understanding that helping someone else was worth the sacrifice. Even tasks like airing bedding became communal events, Entire blocks hung blankets outside at the same time, creating long rows of fabric swaying in the wind. The sight lifted spirits. It meant families were still trying, still caring, still finding ways to keep their homes livable despite the endless shortages. When epidemics threatened to spread, communities organised small systems of care. Older children delivered boiled water to sick neighbours. Adults cleaned shared spaces more frequently, wiping down tables and sweeping walkways to reduce contamination. Without modern disinfectants, these actions carried enormous importance. Through all this, civilians found that cooperation didn't just make hygiene easier, it made life feel more humane. Even in the absence of comfort, people created a sense of belonging through their shared efforts. Their world remained uncertain, but the simple act of helping one another offered steadiness and warmth. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians handled illness and medical care when hygiene was limited and supplies were incredibly scarce. Illness during the war became one of the greatest fears civilians carried, not only because medical help was limited, but because hygiene, the simplest form of prevention, was almost impossible to maintain. With little soap, scarce clean water, and overcrowded living spaces, even minor sicknesses could spread quickly. Families learned to manage health with whatever tools they had, relying on patience, caution, and traditional remedies passed down through generations. When someone in the household fell ill, the first response was to separate them from the rest of the family as much as living space allowed. A corner of a room, a bed near a window, or even a small cot in the kitchen became an improvised sick area. Cleanliness around the patient became a priority. Cloths were changed frequently, sometimes just rinsed and dried, other times boiled if fuel was available. Windows were kept open to allow fresh air to circulate, even during cold months, because people believed it carried illness away. Without disinfectants, civilians turned to boiling water. Anything that could be safely submerged, cups, spoons, cloth strips, or small tools, was boiled to reduce the risk of spreading infection. This method became the closest thing to sterilisation most families could manage. Water itself was precious, so boiling it meant sacrificing part of the household's daily supply, but families rarely hesitated. Supporting the sick required careful routine. People wiped feverish faces with damp cloths, cooled foreheads with water-filled jars, and offered warm herbal drinks made from mint, chamomile, or willow bark. These infusions didn't cure illnesses, but they provided comfort and hydration when nothing else was available. For respiratory issues, mothers placed bowls of hot water near the patient, allowing the steam to ease coughing. When someone developed a wound or injury, improvised care became essential. Civilians rinsed wounds with boiled water, covered them with strips torn from old shirts, and checked them daily for signs of infection. Without soap or antiseptic, they relied on cleanliness, fresh air, and vigilance. People knew that even a small neglected cut could become dangerous in wartime conditions. If a doctor was available, families walked long distances to seek help, often waiting in crowded lines outside makeshift clinics. Doctors did what they could with limited supplies, offering advice on hygiene and infection control that civilians followed carefully. Saltwater rinses, boiled bandages, and frequent airing of rooms were among the most common recommendations. In many homes, caring for the sick became a shared responsibility. Neighbours brought boiled water when a family's supply ran low, offered spare cloths for bandages, or helped watch children so adults could focus on the patient. These gestures, though small, made a significant difference during long illnesses. The emotional burden of sickness was heavy. Without access to hospitals or medicines, families carried the constant worry that a simple fever could worsen. Yet despite the fear, they continued to care with steadiness and hope. Their routines, checking temperatures, refreshing cloths, changing sheets, were done quietly, with gentle hands and patient hearts. As days passed and the sick began to recover, the atmosphere in the home shifted. Windows that once stayed open for airflow now let in sunlight. The bedding was washed in basins, the room slowly returning to its normal rhythm. Recovery was not just a relief. It was a reminder that even with almost no resources, careful hygiene practices and human perseverance still made a difference. In the next part, we'll explore how wartime hygiene shaped food handling and preservation, a challenge that demanded constant attention and creativity when safety depended on every small choice. Handling and preserving food during the war became a delicate balance between necessity and caution, especially when hygiene supplies were nearly non-existent. Without soap to clean hands, surfaces, or utensils, civilians relied on methods rooted in patience, careful observation, and long-practiced traditions. Every meal began long before cooking, with the quiet task of making sure food was safe enough to prepare. Vegetables were rinsed in basins of well water, even when water was scarce. Families let the dirt settle at the bottom, then lifted the produce gently from the top, hoping to leave most of the sediment behind. When water was too limited for rinsing, people wiped vegetables with cloths, removing soil as best as they could. Root vegetables like potatoes and carrots, which stored well, often became staples not only because they were filling, but because they were easier to clean without soap. Meat was a rare luxury, and handling it without hygiene products required extra caution. Civilians checked it carefully for signs of spoilage, relying on smell, colour, and texture. If meat seemed even slightly unsafe, families cooked it for a long time, believing extended boiling would protect them from illness. Bones, fat, and scraps were saved and reused in soups, maximising every bit of nutrition. Cutting boards and knives were rinsed immediately after use. Without disinfectants, people poured boiling water over them when they could, or wiped them with cloths dipped in salty water. Some rubbed surfaces with ash, a method passed down through older generations, which helped remove grease when soap was not available. Bread, often dry and dense, had its own challenges. Without proper storage, it attracted mould quickly. Civilians inspected each loaf before slicing, cutting away large sections if mould appeared. No one enjoyed throwing food away, but safety mattered. Breadcrumbs and stale pieces were repurposed into soups or toasted to extend their life. Preservation became essential. In the absence of refrigeration, families turned to traditional methods, drying herbs, smoking small pieces of meat, or pickling vegetables in jars filled with brine or vinegar. These jars were handled with extreme care, rinsed with boiling water and sealed tightly. A single spoiled jar could waste precious food, so people checked them constantly for leaks, bubbles, or off smells. Dairy products were consumed quickly, often within the same day. Milk was boiled to prevent souring and reused in soups or baked dishes. Butter, when available, was stored in cool cellars or wrapped in cloth soaked in cold water. Despite these efforts, spoilage was a constant concern. Waste was heartbreaking, but preventing illness mattered more than preserving food that had gone bad. Leftovers were kept in covered pots, placed in the coolest corner of the house. Without soap, pots were rinsed carefully the next day, even if that meant using the same small amount of water multiple times. Most families preferred to cook just enough food for one meal to avoid having to store anything overnight. Cleanliness in the kitchen became less about spotless surfaces and more about mindful habits, covering food, washing hands with even a trickle of water, keeping utensils off the floor, and ensuring that every item used in meal preparation was handled with intention. These routines helped families maintain a fragile sense of safety in a time when foodborne illness could easily spread. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians managed personal grooming, hair, nails, and basic body care, without the familiar products they once relied on. Personal grooming during the war became a quieter, slower practice that civilians approached with patience, because without soap, shampoo, or modern tools, even simple tasks like washing hair or trimming nails required planning. People no longer groomed themselves for appearance alone. Instead, they did it to maintain comfort, prevent irritation, and preserve a sense of dignity when the world around them felt unpredictable. Hair care was one of the biggest challenges. Without shampoo, families used warm water mixed with small amounts of baking soda, vinegar, or even stale beer when available. These substitutes didn't create foam or fragrance, but they helped remove excess oil. Many civilians brushed their hair thoroughly every morning and night, believing that long, steady strokes distributed natural oils and kept the scalp healthier. Women often wore braids or tight buns to keep dust and dirt from settling into their hair during long days outdoors. Men, on the other hand, kept their hair shorter whenever possible. A short haircut was easier to clean, less likely to tangle, and reduced the amount of water needed for washing. Razors dulled quickly, so shaving became infrequent. Men smoothed their beards with warm water and a cloth, trimming only when the hair became uncomfortable. Nails required constant attention. Without soap, dirt collected easily, especially under the nails, so people trimmed them regularly or scraped them clean with small knives. Children were reminded daily to keep their nails short to prevent infections, since even small scratches could become troublesome in unhygienic conditions. Filing was done with rough stones or pieces of metal, tools that served well enough despite their crude nature. Skin care adapted to the environment. Civilians washed their faces with cool water in the mornings to refresh themselves and again in the evenings to remove the day's dust. When someone's skin became dry or irritated, families turned to natural remedies, rendered animal fat, simple oils, or herbal-infused water. These mixtures lacked luxury but restored softness and reduced discomfort. Some civilians created makeshift cloth wipes from old garments, using them to gently rub away sweat or grime. Foot care held special importance. Long walks to wells, fields, or shelters made feet vulnerable to blisters and infections. People washed their feet before bed whenever water allowed, soaking them briefly in warm basins or wiping them with damp cloths. Socks were aired daily, even if they couldn't be washed, and boots were checked for stones or broken seams that could cause injury. Oral hygiene changed as well. Toothpaste became rare early in the war, so civilians used small amounts of baking soda, charcoal, or simply water. Toothbrushes were treasured possessions. When bristles wore down, people tied small cloth strips to sticks or used chewed twigs to clean their teeth. The taste was unpleasant, but the practice helped prevent tooth pain at a time when dentists were difficult to reach. Despite the shortages, grooming rituals brought a sense of stability. A brushed head of hair, clean feet, trimmed nails, or a freshly washed face gave civilians the feeling of being in control of at least one part of their lives. These simple acts created a quiet resilience that helped them endure long days shaped by uncertainty. In the next part, we'll explore how wartime hygiene shaped sleeping arrangements, bedding care, and the search for comfort in crowded households. Sleeping arrangements during the war were shaped as much by limited hygiene as by limited space. Civilians learned to create comfort from whatever materials they had, often sharing small rooms with several family members or neighbours. Bedding could not be washed frequently, so people developed routines to keep it as clean and fresh as possible without soap or consistent access to water. Every morning, blankets and mattresses were taken outdoors whenever the weather allowed. People believed strongly in the cleansing power of sunlight and fresh air. Even on cold days, bedding was draped over balconies, fences, or windowsills, the fabric fluttering in the wind. This helped remove moisture, reduce odours, and shake loose dust that accumulated overnight. Sheets were changed rarely. Most families owned only one set, sometimes two if they were fortunate. So washing them meant spending hours heating water, rinsing by hand, and drying them indoors for days. Instead, civilians beat the fabric with sticks or shook it vigorously outside, hoping to lift dust and invisible grime. Pillows presented another challenge. They could not be washed at all, so people aired them daily and occasionally opened the seams to remove the stuffing, spreading it in the sun before returning it to its case. Though time-consuming, this ritual extended the life of bedding in a world where replacements were nearly impossible to find. Nighttime hygiene routines were kept simple but meaningful. Washing faces and hands with small amounts of water became a calming habit, signalling the end of the day. Parents wiped their children's feet with damp cloths, knowing that going to bed with dusty skin could cause irritation or infections. Even this small act brought comfort, warmth, and a sense of care. In overcrowded homes, privacy was scarce. Families organised sleeping spaces with quiet cooperation, arranging blankets on floors, benches, or shared beds. Older relatives often slept closest to stoves for warmth, children in the centre for safety, and adults near doors in case they needed to respond to nighttime emergencies. Despite the tight arrangements, people treated each other with gentleness. They turned slowly in bed to avoid disturbing others, whispered instead of speaking, and respected boundaries that existed only in imagination. Bed bugs and lice became common, especially in areas hit hardest by warfare. Without chemical treatments, civilians fought them with boiling water, vinegar, and constant laundering of small items. Mattresses were brushed with stiff tools or sprinkled with ash before being aired in the sun. These methods were imperfect, but they helped reduce infestations enough to let people sleep more peacefully. When air raid sirens sounded, sleep was disrupted, and civilians rushed to basements or shelters carrying blankets or coats. These spaces were damp, crowded, and poorly ventilated, making hygiene even more difficult. Still, people tried to create small comforts, spreading blankets on crates, hanging cloths for privacy, or sharing warm tea to ease the cold. Sleep was never guaranteed, but the quiet moments before bed became precious. Families whispered stories, said goodnight with soft voices, and found emotional rest even when physical rest was uncertain. Maintaining these bedtime rituals gave civilians a sense of continuity when the world outside felt unpredictable. In the next part, we'll explore how clothing maintenance, repairs, and fabric care evolved, when replacing garments was nearly impossible and hygiene supplies were scarce. Clothing during the war became more than something to wear. It became something to preserve, repair, and protect at all costs. With shops empty and new garments nearly impossible to obtain, civilians relied on the clothes they already owned, making every piece last far longer than it ever had before. Hygiene shortages added another layer of difficulty, as fabrics absorbed dust, sweat, and smoke with no soap to wash them regularly. Families developed careful routines to maintain their clothing and keep it usable. Garments were hung outdoors daily, allowing wind and sunlight to refresh the fibres. Even in winter, people stepped outside with armfuls of coats, dresses and shirts, shaking them gently to release dust. The cold, crisp air helped reduce odours, giving the fabric a faint freshness that made garments more comfortable to wear. Washing clothes was rare, so spot cleaning became essential. Civilians cleaned small stains with damp cloths, or rubbed ash into oily spots before brushing it off. Vinegar diluted in water helped lift certain marks, though many stains simply stayed. Instead of chasing perfect cleanliness, people focused on maintaining the durability of their clothes. Repairs were constant. Needles and thread became treasured tools, often passed between neighbours. Women patched knees, elbows, and collars with mismatched fabrics, creating a mosaic of colours and textures. Children's clothes were especially worn, so patches layered over older patches formed a kind of story stitched into the fabric. These repairs, though not elegant, were done with pride and care. Sweaters unravelled from years of wear were not thrown away. Families unpicked the remaining threads and reknit them into new scarves, gloves, or socks. Every fibre was used, even the short pieces that once might have been discarded. Wool garments held warmth better than most materials, so civilians did whatever they could to keep them functional. Shoes required their own attention. Leather dried and cracked without proper cleaning, especially in harsh climates. People used scraps of fat, oil, or wax to soften the material, rubbing it into the leather with cloths. When soles wore thin, civilians attached makeshift replacements using rope, wooden pieces, or layers of fabric sewn tightly together. Children often went barefoot in warm months to avoid wearing out their shoes. Underclothes were washed more frequently than outer garments, but still with great difficulty. Without soap, people rinsed them with warm water and ash, rubbing gently to avoid damaging the already fragile fabric. These items dried quickly when hung near stoves, though they often took on the scent of smoke. Storage became another form of hygiene. Clothes were kept in wooden chests, drawers, or baskets lined with herbs to discourage insects. Lavender, mint, or even dried leaves helped reduce odours and prevent moth damage. Some families placed bricks warmed by the fire inside storage boxes to keep dampness away during cold nights. Civilians learned to accept imperfections in their clothing. Frayed cuffs, faded colours, and uneven patches were no longer signs of neglect but symbols of survival. Each repaired garment represented hours of labour and the determination to hold on to normalcy in a world where so much had been lost. Despite the shortages, people took pride in their appearance when they could. Brushing coats carefully, smoothing skirts, tying clean scarves, or polishing boots with cloths brought small moments of confidence and dignity. These quiet rituals reminded civilians that they were not powerless, even as the war reshaped nearly every part of their lives. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians cared for infants and young children who required constant hygiene attention in a world where even the simplest supplies were scarce. Caring for infants and young children during the war demanded extraordinary patience, especially when hygiene supplies were nearly impossible to obtain. Soap, clean cloths, warm water, and medical creams, items that once seemed ordinary, became rare treasures. Parents had to improvise daily, creating routines that balanced cleanliness, safety, and comfort in circumstances that offered almost none of these things. Diapers were among the biggest challenges. Disposable versions did not exist, and soft cotton was scarce, so families made diapers from old shirts, worn bed sheets, or fabric scraps sewn together. These cloths needed frequent washing, yet water was limited and soap unavailable, so parents rinsed them with warm water and ash, scrubbing gently by hand before hanging them near stoves to dry. Even when fully cleaned, the diapers often held faint odours, but they were dry, warm, and safe for the child. More than enough for parents who worked tirelessly to provide care. Bathing an infant required planning. Heating water took time and fuel, both of which were precious. Parents warmed small pots and poured the water into a basin, testing the temperature carefully with their wrist. Without soap, babies were washed with soft cloths, and great care was taken to clean sensitive areas to prevent irritation. Mothers often steeped chamomile or mint leaves in the water, believing the herbs soothed the skin and provided a calming scent. These gentle baths became moments of tenderness in otherwise difficult days. Clothing for infants was constantly reused. Sweaters and small socks were mended again and again, often passed between families as children outgrew them. A tiny coat might be repaired a dozen times, each stitch a testament to the determination to keep a child warm. Cotton shirts, once soft, became thin with age, but parents layered whatever they had to protect children from cold drafts that slipped through damaged walls. Feeding required just as much care as bathing. Bottles were boiled whenever fuel allowed, though glass cracked easily under repeated heat. When a bottle broke, parents improvised with spoons, cups, or cloth feeding methods. Nursing mothers tried to keep up their strength despite limited food, knowing their milk was often the safest option for their infants. Cleanliness extended to the small spaces where babies slept. Cradles were lined with blankets that were shaken outdoors daily. Parents checked for insects, brushed mattresses with dry cloths, and placed dried herbs near bedding to deter pests. Sleep was light and protective. Any cough or cry sent a parent's heart racing. Neighbours often helped care for infants, especially in households where one parent was away or working long hours. Older children watched siblings while mothers fetched water. Women shared cloth scraps for diapers, traded herbal remedies, or helped wash clothing in communal areas. These acts of cooperation lightened the burden, reminding families that they were not alone in their struggle. Despite the challenges, infants brought hope. Their soft breaths, tiny hands, and drowsy smiles offered moments of peace that lifted the spirits of entire households. Caring for them required constant attention, but also brought comfort, a reminder that life continued even in the harshest times. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians managed hygiene in rural areas, where conditions were different, but challenges were just as demanding. Rural civilians faced a different set of hygiene challenges during the war, shaped not by crowded buildings or damaged infrastructure, but by distance, isolation, and the constant need to work the land. Life in the countryside offered slightly more access to natural water sources, yet the lack of soap, tools, and medical supplies made cleanliness just as difficult as in cities. Families adapted by relying on tradition, resourcefulness, and the quiet routines that rural life had always demanded. Most homes depended on wells, streams, or hand pumps for water. While these sources were reliable, collecting water required physical effort. People carried heavy buckets across long paths, often making several trips a day just to meet basic needs. Water was used sparingly, first for drinking and cooking, then for washing hands or clothes, and finally for cleaning floors. Even with access to more water than city dwellers, families respected every drop. Bathing followed natural rhythms. In warm months, people bathed in rivers or lakes, choosing quiet areas shielded by trees. Without soap, they scrubbed their skin with handfuls of sand or small river stones to remove dirt. Children splashed happily, their laughter carrying across the fields, unaware that these moments doubled as essential hygiene. In winter, bathing indoors became rare. Families washed only the most necessary areas using basins of warm water heated on stoves. Feet, hands, and faces were cleaned daily, while full baths were saved for special occasions or days when extra firewood was available. Laundry routines were shaped by weather and seasons. Women washed clothes in streams, kneeling on flat rocks, beating the fabric rhythmically. Water was cold, sometimes painful, but the flowing current helped remove dirt more effectively than standing water in a basin. Clothes dried on bushes, fences, or ropes stretched across open yards, fluttering like flags against the rural sky. Homes in the countryside collected dust quickly from fields and unpaved roads. Sweeping became a daily habit. Floors were often made of wood or packed earth, so people used simple brooms made from twigs or dried grasses. Without soap for mopping, families relied on fresh air to keep rooms livable. Windows stayed open whenever possible, allowing breezes to sweep through kitchens and bedrooms. Rural hygiene also relied on natural remedies. Ash from wood-burning stoves became a universal cleaning agent. Vinegar brewed from apples or berries helped clean surfaces, soothe irritated skin, and repel insects. Herbs such as thyme, mint, and sage hung from rafters, adding freshness to homes and providing simple medicinal options. Caring for animals added another layer of responsibility. Civilians washed their hands frequently, sometimes just with water, after tending to livestock. Clean straw was placed in barns, and tools were wiped down regularly to avoid spreading illness among animals that families depended on for food and income. Even with endless work and few supplies, rural families maintained remarkable discipline in their routines. Their connection to nature offered a quiet sense of stability, reminding them that seasons continued regardless of the war's uncertainty. And within this steady rhythm, hygiene became a blend of practicality, tradition, and resilience. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians living in shelters and bunkers handled hygiene when normal routines disappeared completely. For civilians forced to spend long hours, or even nights, in shelters and bunkers, hygiene became one of the most difficult aspects of survival. These underground spaces, often cramped and poorly ventilated, were designed for protection, not comfort. Families gathered tightly together, carrying blankets, coats, and a few belongings, hoping the danger outside would pass quickly. But the longer they stayed, the harder it became to maintain even the simplest routines of cleanliness. Most shelters had no running water. People entered with filled canteens or jars, knowing every drop had to last. Water was used sparingly, a small sip for drinking, a dampened cloth for wiping a child's face, a quick rinse of hands after touching dusty floors. Even these tiny acts required careful thought, as no one knew how long they might remain underground. The air grew heavy quickly. With dozens of people breathing in the same confined space, the scent of bodies, smoke residue from clothing, and damp blankets became unavoidable. Ventilation shafts helped, but only slightly. Civilians opened shelter doors whenever alarms paused, letting in a brief wash of fresh air before sealing themselves inside again. Sleeping arrangements were improvised. People spread blankets on concrete floors or sat upright against walls. Coats doubled as pillows, and children curled in their parents' laps. Bedding collected dust and sweat, but there was no way to air it out until morning. Families shook blankets vigorously once they surfaced, sending clouds of dust into early daylight before folding everything for the next alarm. Toilets, when present at all, were usually basic buckets in curtained-off corners. Maintaining hygiene around these areas required cooperation and courtesy. People lined up patiently, cleaned the buckets with limited water, and used ashes or soil to reduce odours. Shame and embarrassment faded as necessity forced everyone to adapt with quiet understanding. Hands could not always be washed, so civilians wiped them with cloths, dried leaves, or scrap paper. Mothers kept small pieces of fabric specifically for cleaning children, rinsing them only when they returned home. Even these small cloths became essential tools of care. Food inside bunkers was eaten cold, directly from containers, with little ability to clean utensils. Families brought simple meals, bread, boiled potatoes, apples, foods that required minimal preparation and created little mess. After eating, people wrapped the remains carefully, knowing even crumbs might attract pests in underground spaces. Despite the discomfort, civilians found small ways to maintain a sense of order. Some swept shelter floors with their hands or branches, pushing dust into corners. Others folded their blankets neatly, or set up small areas for children to play quietly. These gestures softened the harshness of bunker life, and gave people the feeling of control during moments of fear. Hygiene in these shelters wasn't about achieving cleanliness, it was about preserving dignity. People washed their hands the moment they returned home, wiped their faces, aired out their clothes, and breathed deeply to shake off the stillness of underground hours. The shelters protected their lives, but the routines afterward restored their sense of being human. In the next part, we'll explore how limited hygiene shaped the work routines of civilians who laboured long days in factories, fields, and reconstruction zones. Civilians who worked long days in factories, fields, and reconstruction zones faced some of the harshest hygiene challenges of the war. Physical labour covered them in sweat, dust, oil, and grime, yet they returned home each night with little more than a small basin of water to clean themselves. Despite this, they developed steady routines that allowed them to stay as healthy and comfortable as conditions permitted. Factory workers dealt with soot, grease, and metal shavings that clung to their skin and clothing. With no soap, they wiped their hands on worn rags dipped in warm water or saltwater solutions. These cloths darkened quickly, but even a small amount of moisture helped clean away the thick residue from machinery. Workers often rinsed their faces and necks before heading home, knowing the dust from factory floors would spread throughout their living space unless removed. Those who laboured in fields had different but equally demanding challenges. Dirt packed under their nails, sweat soaked their clothing, and wind carried soil into their hair and eyes. Washing fully after a long day in the sun was rarely possible, so farm workers focused on cleaning their hands, feet, and faces. A small bowl of water at the doorway became a familiar sight in farmhouses. People stopped there first, splashing away dust so they wouldn't track it into the house. Clothing absorbed the heaviest burden of physical work. Factory uniforms and farm garments were often worn for days without proper washing. Workers brushed off dirt with stiff tools, shook out dust in yards, and hung garments near stoves to dry sweat. Stains became part of the fabric, and civilians accepted them as unavoidable marks of labour. Food preparation after long work days required special care. Civilians knew their hands were dirty, so families prioritised rinsing with whatever water they had before touching food. Some rubbed their hands with ash or sand before rinsing, a technique that works surprisingly well for removing tough grime. Fatigue made hygiene harder to maintain, yet people insisted on these routines, aware that small efforts prevented sickness. Injuries were common: scrapes from rough tools, burns from machinery, or cuts from sharp metal. Without soap or antiseptic, wounds had to be cleaned with boiled water and covered with cloth strips. Workers checked injuries daily, watching for signs of infection, knowing that even small problems could worsen quickly. Hair care also adapted to work environments. Factory workers tied their hair tightly to keep it away from machines, while field workers covered their heads with scarves or hats to reduce dust. After work, a simple rinse or brushing became essential to remove debris. Although these routines were imperfect, they brought a sense of normalcy. Body odour, dirt and discomfort became part of daily life, but civilians learned to manage them with patience. They found small comforts in washing their hands after a long shift, rinsing sweat from their brows, or cleaning their feet before bed. These brief moments of care offered relief from exhaustion and reinforced the idea that hygiene, though limited, still mattered. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians coped with the absence of feminine hygiene products, relying on creativity and resilience to maintain personal dignity. For women living through the war, the lack of feminine hygiene products created one of the most private and challenging struggles of daily life. Items that had once been purchased easily, pads, cotton, sanitary cloths, disappeared early in the conflict, leaving women to improvise month after month with whatever materials they could find. Maintaining dignity, comfort and cleanliness became an ongoing task shaped by creativity and quiet perseverance. Most women relied on washable cloths they made at home. Old sheets, worn flannel, and scraps of soft fabric were cut into squares or long strips, layered for absorbency, and sewn with simple stitches. These cloths were used, rinsed, washed, and reused many times. Without soap, washing them required extra care. Women soaked the cloths in warm water mixed with ash or salt, scrubbing gently before rinsing in clear water. Drying them became another challenge, especially when privacy was scarce. Women often hung the cloths indoors near stoves or spread them discreetly under beds where warm air could circulate. Some used herbal infusions like chamomile or thyme to rinse fabrics, hoping the scent would improve freshness. Pain and discomfort were part of the monthly routine. Hot water bottles were rare, so women warmed stones near stoves, wrapped them in cloth, and pressed them to their abdomen for relief. Tea made from mint, raspberry leaves, or willow bark became a common remedy. Women shared these methods quietly with neighbours and daughters, passing along knowledge grounded in tradition. Clothing choices during menstruation were influenced heavily by hygiene limitations. Women wore extra layers of undergarments or tied cloth belts around their waist to secure homemade pads. Dark skirts became practical, hiding stains more easily, and many women preferred to stay close to home during heavier days. In workplaces or shelters, managing hygiene required even more caution. Privacy was limited, and access to water unpredictable. Women carried small bundles of cloth in hidden pockets, stepping aside to change discreetly whenever possible. Used cloths were wrapped carefully and taken home for washing, never left behind. Infection was a constant concern. Without proper hygiene products, women paid close attention to their health, monitoring irritation or signs of illness. They cleaned themselves with warm water whenever possible, using soft cloths rather than rough materials to avoid abrasions. Mothers taught daughters the importance of cleanliness during their monthly cycles, emphasizing methods that preserved comfort and safety. Despite the difficulties, women supported one another. In communities, small groups exchanged cloth scraps, needles, or herbal mixtures. Older women often helped younger ones prepare their first set of reusable cloths, offering guidance shaped by years of experience. These acts of care strengthened bonds during a time when isolation and hardship were widespread. Maintaining dignity became a quiet victory. Even with limited resources, women found ways to care for their bodies, adapting with strength and patience. Their resilience was not often spoken about, but it shaped their daily lives in profound ways. In the next part, we'll explore how limited hygiene influenced older civilians, whose age made them especially vulnerable in a world with few medical supplies and little water to spare. Older civilians faced some of the greatest hygiene challenges during the war, as age made them more vulnerable to illness, discomfort, and infection at a time when even basic supplies had vanished. Tasks that younger people managed with effort, washing with limited water, carrying buckets, rinsing clothes, became physically difficult or impossible for the elderly. Families and communities stepped in to help, but shortages still shaped every aspect of older adults' daily routines. Bathing was particularly challenging. Many older people could no longer bend easily or withstand cold temperatures, so families washed them gently with warm cloths instead of full baths. A basin placed near the stove became the centre of these routines. Caregivers warmed water slowly, then wiped the face, hands and arms first, followed by legs and feet. These quiet washing moments brought comfort, warmth, and a sense of being cared for, even when resources were few. Clothing also required attention. Elderly civilians often had only a few garments, and these were washed infrequently because of limited water. Families tried to keep clothing as clean as possible by airing it outdoors, brushing off dust and spot cleaning with warm cloths. Sweaters, shawls, and layered garments were essential for warmth, especially in homes damaged by the war or lacking steady fuel. Because older skin was more sensitive, itchy fabrics and unwashed materials caused irritation. Families used simple remedies, soft cloth wraps, herbal compresses, or small amounts of oil to soothe discomfort. Even these small acts made a difference when medical creams and lotions were unavailable. Feet required constant care. Walking long distances to wells or shelters strained joints and caused blisters or sores. Without proper hygiene, these small wounds could become dangerous. Caregivers soaked elderly feet in warm water whenever possible, trimmed nails carefully, and checked daily for signs of infection. Clean socks were a luxury, so families dried them near stoves to remove moisture and reduce odour. Oral hygiene also declined during the war. Dentures, if someone had them, were difficult to clean without soap, so people soaked them in boiled water or rubbed them with salt. Those without dentures struggled to chew hard bread or tough vegetables, so families softened meals with broths or mashed ingredients to reduce discomfort. Shelter life was particularly hard on older civilians. Cold concrete floors, stale air, and long periods of sitting made their joints stiff and breathing difficult. Families brought extra blankets to wrap around them, but hygiene often suffered during long nights underground. Once home again, caregivers wiped faces and hands, brushed hair, and helped them change clothing to restore a sense of normalcy. Despite the challenges, older civilians brought a calming presence to households. They shared stories, offered guidance, and encouraged younger people to stay patient and hopeful. Their resilience helped families maintain emotional stability even when practical routines were strained. Communities looked after their elders collectively. Neighbours fetched water, mended clothing, or prepared warm drinks for those who needed help. These acts of care kept older civilians safe and reminded everyone that survival was not just about enduring hardship, but about protecting one another. In the next part, we'll explore how pets and working animals were cared for when food, water, and hygiene supplies were limited for humans and animals alike. Caring for pets and working animals during the war became a challenge wrapped in responsibility and affection. Civilians relied on animals for companionship, help with labour, and emotional stability. Yet hygiene supplies for animals were even harder to obtain than those for humans. Families adapted by using simple routines, natural materials, and a great deal of patience to keep their animals as healthy and clean as possible. Dogs and cats were washed rarely, often only with water, since soap was reserved strictly for medical use, or the rare moment when a family needed it most. A basin or bucket placed outdoors became the washing spot. People poured warm water over their animals using cups or ladles, gently rubbing dirt from fur with their hands or soft cloths. In summer, some animals bathed in streams, shaking off water afterward in big, joyful sprays. Brushing became the main form of cleanliness. Civilians brushed their animals daily when possible, using worn-out brushes or handmade combs crafted from wood. This helped remove dust, loose fur, and insects. Cats cleaned themselves naturally, but even they sometimes needed help when fur became matted from ash or mud. Brushing sessions became moments of silent bonding, offering comfort to both the animal and the person. Working animals like horses, donkeys, and oxen required more structured care. After long days pulling carts or ploughing fields, their coats were covered in dirt and sweat. Without soap, civilians wiped them down with cloths dipped in warm water, then brushed them thoroughly. Hooves were checked for stones and cracks daily, as infections could quickly develop without proper hygiene. Clean straw was essential for bedding, but scarcity meant families replaced it less often. They removed dirty layers, added fresh handfuls where needed, and swept barns regularly to reduce smells and insects. These chores demanded effort, yet they protected animals from discomfort and illness. Feeding areas also needed attention. Buckets, troughs, and bowls were rinsed with water, sometimes rubbed with ash to cut through dried residue. Families knew that spoiled food or unclean containers could cause sickness, so they prioritized keeping feeding spaces as sanitary as possible, even if it meant using precious water. Pets provided emotional relief during the war. Children hugged their dogs during air raid sirens, and adults found comfort in the steady presence of animals who didn't understand the chaos. Caring for these companions reminded civilians of normal life, bringing warmth into homes where anxiety often lingered. Communities sometimes shared resources for animals. Neighbours exchanged extra scraps or helped mend harnesses. When a working animal was injured, families gathered to clean the wound using boiled water and strips of cloth, offering support just as they would for a human. Despite shortages, animals were rarely neglected. Civilians understood their value, not just for labour or safety, but for the companionship they offered in difficult times. Every small act of care, whether brushing a coat or cleaning a feeding trough, helped maintain the well-being of creatures who stood by their side. In the next part, we'll explore how hygiene shaped emotional well-being, and how civilians coped with the stress of living without the comfort of cleanliness. Living without regular hygiene during the war affected civilians not only physically, but emotionally and mentally. Cleanliness had once provided a sense of order and normalcy, a quiet reassurance that life was steady and predictable. When soap, water, and privacy became scarce, people felt the loss deeply. They adapted swiftly on the outside, but inside many struggled with the discomfort, anxiety, and sense of heaviness that came from never feeling fully clean. One of the strongest emotional effects came from the constant presence of dust, sweat, and smoke. Clothing absorbed the sense of daily life. Fires, factories, shelters, and people carried these smells with them everywhere. They grew used to it out of necessity, yet many longed for the crisp feeling of freshly washed garments. That longing, though rarely spoken aloud, rested quietly in the background of daily life. Civilians found comfort in small rituals. A quick rinse of the face in the morning, brushing hair before bed, washing hands in a basin. These routines became anchors in a world that felt unstable. Even when the water was cold or the cloth rough, the simple act of tending to oneself brought a sense of calm. Parents especially understood how important these small comforts were. They made sure children washed their hands, combed their hair, and wiped their faces, not only for hygiene, but because these routines offered emotional steadiness. When children looked more put together, parents felt a little more hopeful. Feelings of embarrassment also surfaced, particularly in crowded living situations. Overlapping bodies in cramped rooms, blankets that couldn't be washed, and the shared discomfort of odours made privacy scarce. People avoided complaining, understanding that everyone faced the same challenges. This unspoken agreement softened potential conflict and helped preserve dignity. Emotional resilience often came from community. Neighbours encouraged each other, shared water, passed along herbal remedies, and offered extra cloths when someone was in need. These acts, though small, created a sense of unity that eased the emotional burden of living without proper hygiene. For many civilians, nature became a source of comfort. A breeze carrying fresh air through an open window, sunlight warming blankets, or the earthy scent of rain brought relief that felt almost spiritual. People cherished these moments, stepping outside whenever possible to breathe deeply and release the stress built up from days spent in dusty, crowded environments. At the same time, some civilians experienced moments of frustration, not being able to wash freely, feeling sticky or dusty, or managing days with limited water wore down their spirits. But each time, they adjusted. They learned to accept imperfection, to focus on what they could control, and to let go of what they couldn't. Despite the emotional weight, civilians found strength in routine, patience, and the quiet understanding that they were enduring something extraordinary. The lack of hygiene didn't break their spirit. It simply reshaped their idea of comfort and encouraged them to find peace in small victories. In the next part, we'll explore how hygiene challenges varied in different climates, from hot, humid regions to areas struggling with severe cold. Climate played a significant role in shaping how civilians managed hygiene during the war. In some regions, heat and humidity intensified discomfort, while in others, freezing temperatures made even basic washing nearly impossible. Each environment brought its own difficulties, and civilians adapted their routines to survive with limited resources, relying on nature when it helped, and working around it when it made things harder. In hot, humid climates, sweat became a constant companion. Clothes clung to the skin, absorbing moisture and gathering dust more quickly. Without soap, civilians rinsed themselves several times a day with small amounts of cool water, wiping their bodies with cloths to remove sweat. These quick washes didn't provide full cleanliness, but they offered temporary relief and helped prevent irritation. People hung their clothing outdoors whenever possible, letting the sun dry and freshen the fabric. Homes were ventilated constantly, with doors and windows left open to allow air to circulate. Even a faint breeze made the heat more tolerable. Families organised their chores around cooler hours, washing at dawn, cooking at dusk, to reduce discomfort and conserve energy. Despite the heat, insects made hygiene even more challenging. Mosquitoes, flies, and ants were drawn to damp clothing, leftover food, and sweat. Civilians burned herbs, used smoke from small wood fires, or placed mint and lavender near beds to deter insects. These methods were imperfect, but they offered some protection. In contrast, colder climates presented the opposite challenge. Water froze quickly, making washing difficult and sometimes painful. People conserved warm water for essential tasks like washing faces, hands, and feet. Full baths were rare in winter, as heating enough water required precious fuel. Instead, civilians wiped their bodies with warm cloths, focusing on areas most prone to discomfort. Clothing became heavier and harder to clean in cold regions. Thick wool layers trapped heat but also trapped sweat. Washing these items was nearly impossible during freezing months, so civilians aired them outdoors, letting the crisp air freshen the fibres. Frost sometimes formed on garments, and people believed the cold helped kill bacteria and odours. Frozen conditions also affected water collection. Wells became difficult to access, rivers iced over, and carrying even a single bucket home required strength and caution. Families melted snow when necessary, though the process was slow and fuel-intensive. Homes grew dry from constant heating. Civilians placed bowls of water near stoves to create moisture in the air, soothing dry skin and easing breathing. Despite the discomfort, the cold offered certain advantages. Fewer insects, less spoilage, and the natural preservation of food helped families manage their supplies. Meanwhile, in temperate regions where seasons shifted dramatically, civilians constantly adjusted their routines. They learned to treat every season as a new challenge, heat bringing sweat, rain bringing mud, and winter bringing dryness. Regardless of climate, civilians adapted with resilience. They observed their environment closely, used what nature provided, and worked around what it took away. Their ability to adjust, day by day, season by season, helped them maintain hygiene in conditions that tested their resourcefulness and patience. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians preserved hygiene during long travel, evacuations and displacement, when even the stability of home was lost. Travel and evacuation during the war created some of the harshest hygiene conditions civilians ever faced. When families were forced to leave their homes, sometimes with only hours of warning, they packed what little they could carry, a few clothes, a blanket, and maybe a pot or basin. Soap, fresh water, and privacy became luxuries almost no one had access to while on the move. Days spent walking or riding in crowded trains left people coated in sweat, dust, and smoke. Clothing that had already been worn for days grew stiff with grime, yet there was no place to wash it. Civilians wiped their faces with small cloths dipped in whatever water they could find, sometimes using water from streams, hand pumps, or even puddles filtered through cloth. These washings were brief, but they brought moments of relief. Train evacuations were especially difficult. People squeezed into packed carriages, sometimes standing for hours with no ventilation. The air quickly grew thick with the smell of unwashed clothing, food, and fear. Parents held their children tightly, trying to shield them from the discomfort of the crowds. When the train paused, civilians rushed outside to breathe fresh air, splash their faces with water, and stretch cramped muscles before being called back inside. Those who travelled by foot created makeshift washing spots along the way. Streams became gathering points. Adults washed hands, faces, and the feet that carried them mile after mile. Children splashed water on their necks, laughed briefly, then continued walking. Sometimes clothing was rinsed and draped over bushes to dry before the journey resumed. These moments of pause, though short, helped maintain morale. Night shelters during travel varied widely. Some civilians slept in barns, others in abandoned buildings or under trees. Bedding, when available, was shaken out each morning, freeing it from debris collected overnight. Without safe water, people relied on simple hygiene principles: brushing away dirt, keeping wounds covered, and avoiding spoiled food. For women and elderly travellers, the challenges were even greater. Privacy was nearly impossible during long evacuations, so hygiene tasks that once felt routine now required courage and careful timing. Families protected each other, forming shields with blankets or coats so someone could wash discreetly. Despite the discomfort, people supported those who struggled most, offering cloths, water, or a moment of rest. Illness during travel became a constant threat. Without clean water or medical supplies, even a small fever or stomach illness could worsen quickly. Mothers wiped their children's faces with cool cloths, boiled water whenever possible, and shared herbal remedies collected along the way. Communities that formed during evacuations helped one another survive, trading small comforts: an extra cup of water, a piece of cloth, a warm corner in a crowded shelter. When civilians finally reached their destinations, whether temporary camps or new homes, the first thing many did was search for water. Washing off the dust of travel became an emotional release, marking the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Even without soap, the feeling of cool water on the skin brought a sense of renewal. In the next part, we'll explore how limited hygiene impacted cooking and meal preparation in communal or shared living spaces, where dozens of families had to navigate cleanliness together. Life in communal or shared living spaces brought a unique set of hygiene challenges, especially when dozens of families were suddenly placed together in schools, barns, camps, or repurposed buildings. Kitchens that once served a single household now had to support entire groups of displaced civilians. Cleanliness depended not just on individual effort but on cooperation, patience, and the ability to share limited resources without conflict. Cooking areas were often improvised. A few tables pushed together served as preparation surfaces, while stoves, when available, became the heart of these temporary communities. Without soap, families wiped down surfaces with damp cloths, or warm water mixed with salt or ash. People cleaned as thoroughly as possible, aware that contamination could spread quickly when so many depended on the same space. Utensils and pots were shared, increasing the need for careful handling. After each use, they were rinsed with hot water if fuel allowed, or scrubbed with sand when water was scarce. Though not ideal, these methods removed debris and prevented food from sticking. People waited patiently for their turn at the stove or basin, understanding that cooperation kept the space functional. Food storage created constant tension. Without refrigeration, families had to eat quickly or risk spoilage. Shared cupboards or shelves held jars, produce, and sacks of grain marked with each family's name. Despite the crowded conditions, civilians respected these boundaries, knowing everyone faced the same shortages. Cooking smells filled the common rooms. Boiling potatoes, stewing vegetables, bread toasted over open flames. These scents brought comfort, but also emphasized how tightly people lived together. Every meal involved negotiation. Who would cook first? Who would fetch water? Who would clean afterward? Despite exhaustion, most stepped forward willingly, knowing the system worked only through participation. Water was one of the most valuable resources in these communal kitchens. People lined up with buckets, jars, and pots, filling them from wells or pumps. Once carried inside, the water was guarded carefully, measured out for washing hands, preparing meals, and cleaning tools. Wastewater was reused whenever safe, first for cooking tasks, then for washing floors, and finally for extinguishing fires in stoves. Dishwashing took on a ritualistic quality. Children often helped, dipping plates into basins of warm water, wiping them with cloths, and passing them on to adults for rinsing. Though the dishes never looked completely clean, families accepted the results with gratitude, appreciating the shared effort behind each meal. Crowded living conditions meant hygiene mistakes had consequences. A spilled pot could cause tension. A poorly cleaned surface could lead to illness. Communities handled these moments quietly, offering reminders rather than blame. Maintaining harmony mattered as much as maintaining cleanliness. Despite limited privacy, families found comfort in shared routines. Preparing meals together created a sense of belonging. People exchanged recipes based on the few ingredients available and shared herbs or spices saved from home. Even laughter found its way into these kitchens, soft, warm, offering relief from the uncertainty outside. At the end of each day, the communal kitchen was swept, the stoves cooled, and the remaining water covered for morning use. Though far from ideal, these shared spaces became places of resilience, proving that cooperation could preserve not just hygiene, but also humanity. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians kept their spirits high by creating small rituals of cleanliness and order in homes, shelters, and communal settings alike. In a world where hygiene was limited and comfort unpredictable, civilians relied heavily on small rituals to maintain a sense of normalcy. These routines did not require soap, clean water, or proper facilities. Instead, they depended on consistency, care, and the human need for order amid chaos. These rituals became emotional anchors, offering stability even when the outside world felt unsteady and overwhelming. One of the simplest rituals involved washing hands and faces at the start and end of each day. Even if the water was cold or scarce, the act itself carried meaning. Parents encouraged children to start fresh each morning, dipping cloths into basins and gently wiping away the dust of sleep. At night, the same routine helped families unwind, signaling that the day's challenges were behind them. Hairbrushing was another soothing ritual. With little access to shampoo, brushing became a way to manage both cleanliness and morale. People brushed slowly, removing dust while calming their thoughts. Mothers braided their daughters' hair, smoothing strands with warm palms, while men combed their hair carefully before meals. These moments were quiet, steady, and comforting. Tidying living spaces also became a daily habit. Even without soap or strong cleaning products, civilians swept floors, folded blankets, and arranged belongings neatly. These small gestures created a feeling of structure. A A tidy room felt safer, warmer, and more controlled, even if dust returned within hours. Families often developed shared rituals to boost spirits. Some lit a single candle during dinner to brighten the room. Others placed fresh herbs in water jars to add a pleasant scent. In the mornings, many opened windows wide to let in air, regardless of the season. The breeze carried away smoke, stale smells, and the heaviness of close living quarters. Clothing care also played a role in emotional hygiene. People brushed dust off coats, smoothed wrinkles from shirts, and aired garments outdoors. Even if the clothes were old or patched, treating them with respect made civilians feel more dignified. Wearing a freshly aired scarf or a cleanly brushed coat offered a small but powerful sense of renewal. Children, especially, benefited from these rituals. Routine helped them feel safer. Parents taught them to wash their hands before meals, brush their hair, and tidy their sleeping spaces. These simple acts created predictability, giving children a sense of identity and responsibility despite the instability around them. Communities developed collective rituals as well. Neighbours swept shared hallways together, hung bedding on the same day, or took turns cleaning communal kitchens. These routines not only preserved hygiene but strengthened bonds. Cooperation reminded civilians they were not alone. Even entertainment carried elements of emotional cleanliness. People shared stories near stoves, sang quiet songs, or played simple games. These activities lifted spirits and kept the mind clear, offering relief from the constant stress of limited hygiene. In many ways, these small rituals mattered more than perfect cleanliness. They helped civilians protect their sense of humanity, maintain mental resilience, and face each day with a little more hope. In the next part, we'll explore how wartime shortages prompted creative substitutes for soap and cleaning materials, leading civilians to invent new solutions from familiar items. As wartime shortages stretched on, civilians grew increasingly inventive in finding substitutes for soap and other cleaning materials. Improvisation became a key part of daily survival. People learned to rely on natural resources, household scraps, and creative techniques passed quietly from neighbour to neighbour. These substitute methods were not perfect, but they helped maintain a level of cleanliness that made life more manageable during long periods of scarcity. One of the most common alternatives was wood ash. When mixed with warm water, ash created a mild alkaline solution that helped cut through grease on dishes, clothing, and even skin. Families stored ash carefully in dry containers, treating it as a valuable tool. Though it lacked fragrance and left a faint residue, it worked well enough to keep essentials clean. Another substitute came from baking soda when available. Civilians used it sparingly to brush teeth, scrub pots, and freshen fabrics. Its effectiveness made it highly prized, and people learned to stretch even the smallest box over many weeks. When baking soda ran out, crushed chalk or charcoal was sometimes used as a gentle abrasive. Vinegar also became a universal cleaning agent. Homemade vinegar, brewed from apples, berries, or leftover scraps, served as a mild disinfectant. People diluted it with water to wipe tables, clean floors, or rinse cloths. Though its sharp scent lingered, households accepted it as a sign that things were at least somewhat clean. Herbs played a surprising role in hygiene. Mint, thyme, chamomile, and sage were steeped in hot water to create fragrant rinses. These herbal infusions freshened skin, soothed irritation, and helped clean small wounds. Families hung bundles of dried herbs near windows to naturally scent the air and discourage insects. Sand and snow became useful substitutes for scrubbing. In rural areas, people rubbed cooking pots with handfuls of sand, using its rough texture to lift burnt bits. In cold regions, fresh snow was packed tightly and used to scrub clothing, blankets, and even wooden floors. The snow absorbed dirt and left behind a surprisingly clean surface once it melted away. Fat and oil also played unexpected roles. Rendered animal fat, softened near the stove, was used to condition leather boots and treat dry skin. A tiny amount could make old shoes last longer or soothe cracked hands. Though these uses weren't glamorous, they were essential. Even stale bread found a purpose. Crumbed bread was pressed onto dusty surfaces, picking up particles that cloths alone couldn't handle. Civilians then shook the crumbs outside, repeating the process until the area felt cleaner. These methods required time and effort, but they fostered a sense of empowerment. Instead of feeling helpless in the face of shortages, civilians discovered that familiar materials held hidden potential. Sharing these ideas strengthened communities as neighbours exchanged tips, traded ingredients, or taught one another how to create makeshift cleaning solutions. Over time, these substitutes became normal parts of daily routines. People adapted so well that many continued using natural methods even after the war ended, appreciating their simplicity and reliability. In the next part, we'll explore how shortages influence grooming standards and social expectations, reshaping how people viewed appearance and personal presentation during wartime. Wartime shortages reshaped grooming standards and social expectations in ways civilians could never have imagined before the conflict began. With soap, shampoo, razors, and clean water so limited, people gradually adjusted their understanding of what it meant to look presentable. Appearance became less about polish and more about effort, less about perfection and more about maintaining dignity under the circumstances. Before the war, grooming had been part of daily routine. Freshly washed faces, neatly combed hair, clean clothing, and the subtle pride that came from being orderly. As the war progressed, these practices shifted dramatically. Civilians could no longer judge themselves, or others, by pre-war standards. Instead, they learned to appreciate the small signs of self-care that were still possible. A brushed coat, tidy braids, trimmed nails, or a face rinsed in cold water. Hairstyles changed as well. Women tied their hair in braids or buns, both to conserve water and to reduce the need for frequent combing. Men allowed their hair to grow longer, or kept makeshift haircuts managed by family members. Many shaved less often, accepting stubble or full beards as part of wartime life. What mattered most was neatness rather than style. Clothing, too, reflected new expectations. Outfits were worn far beyond their original lifespan. Patches, faded colours, and worn elbows became common sights. Civilians took pride in well-maintained garments even if they were old. A clean scarf or carefully mended sleeve carried more meaning than fashionable attire ever had. People admired one another not for elegance, but for the visible effort invested in caring for limited belongings. Social gatherings, when they occurred, had a different atmosphere. Instead of comparing appearances, civilians focused on warmth and companionship. Neighbours complimented each other on fresh air in their clothes, clever repairs, or neatly brushed hair. Kindness replaced judgment, creating a culture of mutual understanding. Even workplaces adapted to new grooming norms. Factory supervisors understood that workers arrived dusty from long walks or covered in grime from previous shifts. Teachers knew children's clothing might be wrinkled or lightly stained. Rather than criticise, many adults encouraged habits that were achievable: washing hands before meals, airing out garments, or brushing dirt from shoes. These small routines built confidence and stability. In shelters, grooming standards softened even further. People accepted the natural look that came from living underground for hours. When they resurfaced, rinsing their faces or adjusting their clothing felt like starting fresh, even if the overall appearance remained simple. Emotional resilience shaped these new norms. Civilians learned to see grooming not as a strict obligation, but as a gentle form of self-respect. They understood that everyone was doing their best with the resources available. A bit of order, a combed part, a smoothed collar, a washed face, helped restore control and pride. Children adapted quickly, modelling the behaviour of adults. They learned to tidy their clothing, brush their hair, and keep small personal items organised. These habits provided comfort and routine, helping them feel secure despite external uncertainty. By the end of the war, many civilians carried newfound appreciation for simplicity. They had learned that appearance was not about luxury, but about maintaining humanity in difficult times. Cleanliness, in whatever form it could take, became a quiet act of resilience, a reminder that even in hardship people could care for themselves and for each other. In the next part, we'll explore how hygiene shaped relationships within families, deepening bonds and creating unspoken understandings during the most challenging years. Hygiene challenges during the war had a deep impact on family relationships, creating new dynamics, quiet understandings, and bonds strengthened by shared routines. Without easy access to soap, clean water, or private spaces, families learned to navigate personal needs together, often communicating through small actions rather than words. These daily interactions, though shaped by hardship, brought many households closer than they had ever been before. One of the strongest shifts came from the need to share everything: basins, cloths, towels, water, and even personal routines. Families waited their turn patiently, respecting each person's moment to wash, however brief it might be. Children learned early to give older relatives space, while parents worked together to divide chores so no one became overwhelmed. These patterns created a rhythm to life that everyone depended on. Caring for one another became an essential part of survival. Parents washed their children's faces in the mornings, combed their hair, and checked their clothing for wear. Children helped fetch water, gather firewood, or air out blankets. Older siblings watched younger ones while parents cleaned or prepared meals. These shared responsibilities lightened the burden and taught children valuable lessons about empathy and cooperation. Couples adapted to the loss of privacy with patience and understanding. Washing in the same small space or sharing limited clothing could have created tension, but many couples grew closer through mutual support. They encouraged one another to rest, took turns handling difficult tasks, and provided comfort after long days spent in crowded shelters or exhausting work environments. Simple acts, straightening a collar, brushing dust from a coat, or heating water for a partner, became quiet expressions of love. Elderly family members were treated with special care. Adult children or grandchildren cleaned their hands, brushed their hair, or helped them wash with warm cloths. These moments were tender, reminding families of their shared past and reinforcing the importance of looking after one another. The effort required to maintain even minimal cleanliness turned into acts of devotion, strengthening emotional bonds. Hygiene routines also created moments of communication. While washing clothes by hand, women often talked with their children or shared stories with neighbours. Men repairing shoes or brushing coats spoke about news, worries, or hopes for the future. These conversations, woven into daily tasks, provided stability and helped families process the world around them. In stressful moments, during air raids, illness, or displacement, hygiene took on a comforting role. Wetting a cloth to cool a fever, brushing a child's hair before sleep, or wiping dust from a loved one's face created a sense of calm. These small routines helped families feel grounded during uncertainty. Even conflicts that arose from overcrowding or exhaustion were often softened by a shared understanding that everyone was struggling. People learned to apologize quickly, forgive easily, and remain patient. They accepted that tensions came from circumstances, not from each other. Through all of this, families discovered that caring for one another physically strengthened emotional connections. The war stripped away conveniences, but it also stripped away distance. In the absence of modern comforts, families learned to depend deeply on each other, to share burdens, celebrate small victories, and find comfort in simple routines. In the next part, we'll explore how civilians adapted hygiene habits after the war ended, and how returning to normal life felt both familiar and surprisingly foreign. When the war finally ended, civilians expected life to return quickly to the routines they once knew, but the transition back to normal hygiene proved slower and more emotional than many anticipated. After years of scarcity, adapting to consistent water, soap, and privacy felt both comforting and strangely unfamiliar. The habits developed during the war lingered, shaping how people approach cleanliness for years to come. The first noticeable change came with the return of water access. Faucets that had been dry or unreliable began to flow again, though not always steadily. Civilians approached running water with gratitude and caution, often using far less than before the war. Families continued to fill basins, reuse rinse water, and carry buckets out of habit. Many found it difficult to break the instinct to conserve every drop, even when water was no longer rationed. Soap reappeared in stores slowly, and its arrival felt like a luxury. People bought bars with quiet excitement, often saving the first one rather than using it immediately. They hesitated to unwrap it, wanting to enjoy the scent and the reminder that life had changed. When they finally used it, lathering hands, washing clothes, or bathing fully, it brought a sense of relief that bordered on overwhelming. Clothing care shifted gradually. Civilians no longer needed to air garments outdoors every day, but many continued the habit because the fresh scent reminded them of resilience. Washing machines were rare, so hand washing remained common for years, even when soap became accessible. Families washed garments more frequently, yet treated them with the same mindfulness developed during shortages: careful scrubbing, thorough rinsing, and thoughtful drying. Bathing routines required emotional adjustment. For many, the first warm bath after years of basin washes felt like stepping into another lifetime. Adults soaked slowly, letting heat ease muscles that had hardened under hardship. Children splashed with joy, unburdened by memories of cold water and rushed rinses. Still, some civilians found full baths uncomfortable at first, as if too much luxury felt undeserved. Over time, comfort returned, but the appreciation for warmth never faded. Hygiene habits formed during the war continued to influence daily life. Civilians kept cloth scraps for cleaning, stored herbs for freshening air, and reused items instead of discarding them. They understood the value of resourcefulness and maintained a respect for supplies that pre-war life had rarely demanded. Emotionally, the return to normal hygiene created a period of reflection. Families remembered washing one another during illness, sharing limited water, and struggling through crowded shelters. These memories made simple acts, washing hands under a faucet, brushing teeth with real toothpaste, or washing blankets fully, feel profound. Many civilians carried a deeper gratitude for cleanliness, seeing it not as a mundane chore but as a privilege. Communities also slowly adjusted. Shared kitchens returned to private spaces. Communal washing areas emptied as families resumed caring for their own homes. Yet the spirit of cooperation remained. Neighbours exchanged soap, shared hot water, or helped repair laundry lines out of habit, reflecting bonds formed during hardship. Even children needed time to adapt. Those who had grown up with limited hygiene initially felt unsure about daily baths or frequent laundry. Parents guided them gently, explaining that the war was over and that new routines could replace the old ones. These shifts marked a symbolic transition into a safer, more predictable world. As everyday hygiene returned, so did a sense of dignity that had never fully disappeared but had been muted by necessity. Civilians embraced these changes slowly but wholeheartedly, carrying forward the lessons of resilience, gratitude, and care. In the final part, we'll reflect on how living without hygiene shaped an entire generation's understanding of cleanliness, comfort, and what it means to endure. The experience of living without reliable hygiene during the war left a deep, lasting impression on the generation who endured it. Cleanliness, once taken for granted, became something far more meaningful, a symbol of stability, safety, and dignity. The hardships civilians faced reshaped their understanding of comfort, teaching them to value even the smallest moments of refreshment and order. For many, the memory of washing from a single basin lingered long after the war. Years later, when they had full kitchens and bathrooms again, they still used water sparingly, saving every drop out of habit. They kept buckets filled, not because they needed them, but because the presence of water represented security. The careful routines they developed during the war, airing blankets, brushing clothes, washing hands before meals, remained part of their lives, not as burdens but as quiet rituals of gratitude. Soap also carried emotional weight. civilians held onto small bars as reminders of survival, sometimes storing one in a drawer simply to enjoy its scent. When washing clothes or bathing with rich lather became normal again, people did so with a deep awareness of what it meant never to have had it. A simple bar of soap became a symbol of peace. The generation who lived through the war passed their lessons to their children. They taught them not to waste water, to treat belongings with care, and to find comfort in simple routines. Parents encouraged children to fold their clothes neatly, wash their hands thoroughly, and appreciate small luxuries: warm baths, fresh linens, clean rooms. These teachings were not warnings but gifts shaped by experience. Many civilians retained a calm approach to discomfort because they had learned to adapt. They understood that dirt did not define a person, and that dignity did not depend on perfect cleanliness. They had lived through years when appearance was shaped by survival, not vanity, and they carried that perspective forward. Communities that once shared water, cloths and herbal remedies continued to look after one another long after the war ended. Neighbours offered help freely, remembering how cooperation had kept them strong. Hygiene had been a collective responsibility, and the bonds formed during that time remained, even as conditions improved. Emotionally, the memory of limited hygiene brought both sorrow and strength. Civilians remembered the exhaustion of crowded shelters, the difficulty of travelling unwashed, and the ache of caring for loved ones without proper supplies. Yet they also remembered resilience, the quiet determination to stay clean as best they could, the pride in patched clothing, and the comfort found in small routines that brought a sense of normal life. Looking back, many described the period not only as a time of hardship, but as a lesson in resourcefulness and gratitude. Cleanliness became a daily reminder of peace, something earned rather than expected. They understood deeply that hygiene was more than a physical necessity. It was a form of emotional grounding, a way of caring for oneself and others. And perhaps the most lasting legacy was the understanding that comfort is fragile, but the human ability to adapt is not. Even in the absence of soap, water and privacy, civilians found ways to preserve dignity, support one another, and maintain a sense of self. Their quiet strength shaped the generations that followed, proving that resilience is often built not through grand actions, but through the humble routines that hold life together in its most difficult moments.